Yes. Thanks, Carla.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please come in. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this, what will be really insightful, inspiring, dynamic discussion this afternoon around mothering in crisis. And as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, on whose land we are meeting today, unceded land, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and particularly pay my respect to the Indigenous stories that are also an important part of understanding how women and mothers decide which pathways they might take in terms of future generations and those particularly female questions. So it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to this launch of the report. And it's a particular pleasure because I have a position at Melbourne University where I'm partly at Melbourne Climate Futures. I'm the Deputy Director at Melbourne Climate Futures, focusing on policy impact and knowledge exchange. And my other role at the university is as a Professor of Environment, Climate and Global Health at the School of Population and Global Health. And as part of my role at Melbourne Climate Futures, we funded a suite of 8 projects over the last year that really looked to transform the way we thought about big climate change issues. And this is a project that I've become very proud of and really passionate about, and I've just really delighted in speaking with Carla and hearing her reflections as the project unfolded over the last, well, a bit more than 12 months, isn't it? So it's one of the gems. There are many, all of the projects are fantastic, and I'd encourage you to have a look at the MCF website, and we have a short video on the Climate Research Accelerator grants that we funded over the last 12 months, and we've just launched another round of funding for those as well for this coming year. But I really think it was a gem that shone out of all the projects that we funded. It looks at something that we haven't really had a large public discussion about just yet, and I really hope that this is one of the catalysts to really bring this much more firmly on the national and international agenda. So my role is to also introduce our speakers this afternoon. So we have Carla Pascoe, who is a lecturer in family history at the University of Tasmania and an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne. And so, as you will know, Carla's research examines family and environmental change, and Carla led the Mothering in Crisis project. And Carla led the project with Catherine Gay, who's a PhD student at the university here and a researcher on the Mothering in Crisis project. And Catherine's doctoral research examines girls in colonial Victoria. And the other team member of the project is Anisa Puri, who's an experienced oral historian and a researcher on the Mothering in Crisis project. Come in. And Anisa has recently completed her PhD on histories of youth migration at Monash University. So this project really is important because we're looking at disciplines that sometimes are a little bit neglected in the context of climate change. So the disciplines of oral history, for example. And so it's my pleasure to really introduce Carla now as the first speaker, and to introduce the project. Thanks, Carla.
Thank you so much, Catherine. We're really delighted that you could be here today. This research this year wouldn't have been possible without the support of Melbourne Climate Futures. And I'd like to acknowledge Director Jackie Peel, as well as the 2 Deputy Directors, Ben Neville and Catherine Bowen. And there's also been a wonderful, really interdisciplinary group of researchers working together on the Melbourne Climate Futures Research Cluster, which has been really inspiring to work with people across all of the faculties of the university. I want to particularly thank my co-researchers, Anissa Puri, Catherine Gay, and Julia Hurst for her insights. And you'll see as our talks today unfold the different kinds of expertise and knowledge that we've brought to the project. But in particular, I want to acknowledge the bravery and generosity of the interviewees who have shared their stories with us, both in Australia and in the UK. These are not always easy things to talk about, and we're really inspired by the stories that these women have shared with us. We hope to do justice to them today. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the background to the project and some of this project's scope. Then Catherine will talk after me, then Anissa, and then I'll talk about the final aspect of the project and draw some conclusions. Essentially, this work grew from some observations I made back in 2019. So I was conducting a project that was creating a history of Australian motherhood, and it involved interviewing mothers of all different ages. And as I spoke to these mothers during the summer of 2019 and into 2020, the Black Summer fires began to engulf vast swathes of Australia and sent smoke spilling out over even greater areas. And as the fires intensified, more and more mothers began to talk to me about their concerns about how environmental change was impacting their families' lives in the present and how it would continue to impact their lives in the future. And I realised that alongside this rapid environmental devastation that we were seeing, a significant cultural shift was also taking place in how we think about climate change, which then had implications for how we think about family. So suddenly we saw that the Black Summer fires precipitated a shift in Australian public opinion that was very noticeable. It was captured in surveys at the time, from people sometimes doubting climate change, and certainly most people thinking it was in a far off future, to recognising that it was here, it was now, and it was serious. And I think the critical thing about this shift in opinion is that the ways that we understand the causes and the impacts of environmental change and disasters shifts how we then in turn experience them. So in other words, when we understand disasters as symptomatic of climate crisis, and actually a harbinger of worse to come, how we think and feel about those disasters changes. So in the past, we often spoke about events like fires and floods and cyclones as acts of God, or once in 100-year events or once in 1,000-year events. And we tended to assume that a person was unlucky to experience an environmental crisis and therefore probably unlikely to experience another one in their lifetime. We're now coming to think about disasters differently and the instability that they wreak. And we're seeing that they're becoming a new normal. And you're going to see this start to come through in the presentations we give today. So this change in how we think about disasters and climate change more broadly, and this sense that we are living through unstable times, is shifting the extent to which parents are now taking these issues into account in their day-to-day work of raising families. And so once I'd realised that that massive environmental change was precipitating cultural change as well, I became really determined to start to study this. And in particular, I realised that there was an amazing opportunity to track this shift as it was actually taking place. So we're in the midst of a really significant cultural shift. But there's a real methodological problem with studying climate change, I think, and particularly the intersection between climate change and culture. Climate change is so amorphous. It takes so many forms, and it's often so ephemeral, except for the times when it erupts in really kind of violent and spectacular ways. So in the research, we've tried to study climate change quite broadly to take in the different forms that it takes. So both climate change as a backdrop to everyday life in the 21st century, and also when it erupts in the form of disasters. We've chosen to focus on mothers in this initial stage because my prior research has shown that parenthood is still distinctly gendered in contemporary Australia. And also the wider disaster studies literature tells us that parental experiences during disasters are also gendered in ways that we'll explain more. So there's three strands to the project that we're going to talk about today. The first one is looking at historical Australian experiences of disasters. So to look at our experiences during previous disasters to try to track, is there something distinctive about the present moment? Can we unpack that by looking at change across time? The second strand is designed to understand the experiences of Australian mothers right now. And as I said, to try to capture this cultural shift as it's occurring. And then the third strand has taken a transnational approach. So we've established a comparative case study in the UK, and we're trying to look at to what extent are these impacts that we're seeing global in the same way that climate change is global, and to what extent are there differences depending on where you are and where you're experiencing them. In terms of methodology, what we could look at for the first strand depended a lot on serendipity. The serendipity of what was collected about different disasters at different points in time, as well as the permissions that govern those archived collections and how readily we could remotely access them. In terms of the second and third strands, we chose our case studies very deliberately. The contemporary Australian interviews are largely conducted in Gippsland, Victoria, and it's because Gippsland has, I think, a really complex and ambivalent relationship to climate change. The region has a history of coal mining and burning that, as we all know, continues to the present day, meaning that the very fossil fuels that have directly and significantly contributed to climate crisis are also powerfully wrapped up in the jobs that have kept the region going, and therefore its sense of collective identity and of heritage as well. And Gippsland has also been at the forefront of recent environmental disasters. We know that they were very hard hit by the Black Summer fires. There were really distressing images coming out of Gippsland during those fires, as well as hard hit by COVID lockdowns, and then again by storms and floods over recent years. They have seen multiple and overlapping crises. The UK hasn't experienced the same kind of intense recent climate-fueled disasters that Australia has, but we've chosen Wales in the UK because of this historic connection to fossil fuels that it shares with Gippsland. So coal mining continues to be associated with historical Welsh identity in the form of museums and heritage collections, though it's not front of mind as much for younger generations, and I'll talk about that a little bit, about the relationship between coal mining and Welsh identity later on. So I just wanted to introduce the talks today to give you a bit of a sense of where the project came from, some of our methodological choices and the scope of research, which we've managed to achieve in 12 months. And I'm going to pass over now to Kat, who's going to talk about the historical arm of the project.
Oh, thanks, Carla. Lovely. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Carla. As I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation for their care of the land, skies, and waters, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to thank Melbourne Climate Futures for their generous support of this project, and to Carla, Julia, and Anissa for all their hard work so far. And note that this presentation does include some images from environmental disasters. We live in a period of rapid environmental change with new and more frequent crises. But mothers and parents have always faced crisis, including environmental disasters. They've been a constant feature of Australian life. On this continent, mothers have mothered through flood and fire, cyclones and drought. But what is the distinctive nature of mothers' experience as gendered parents during disaster? So as Carla introduced, this arm of the project explores mothers' historical encounters with environmental crisis and how these experiences have changed over time. To explore these issues, this part of the project uses archived oral histories regarding historical environmental disasters. We identified several substantial collections in public institutions that interviewed a range of people affected by disaster, not just parents. These interviews go back nearly 50 years, spanning events from 1974 to 2012. They encompass an expansive geographic scope and type of disaster, including cyclones, earthquakes, fires, and floods from the Northern Territory, Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. They include oral histories relating to, as you can see here, Cyclone Tracy, the Newcastle earthquake in 1989, the 2003 Canberra fires, Black Saturday fires of 2009, the 2011 Queensland floods, as well as the 2012 Wagga Wagga floods. We contacted each of the institutions and received transcripts and audio files, and so we were able to conduct this research and analysis remotely. Many of these interviews have access restrictions, so the ones I'm focusing on today are open access, and we will use the closed interviews in future outputs when we've received the correct permissions. So archived interviews have proven a fruitful source through which to understand mothers' historical experience during disasters. Often recorded close to the event, one is struck by the immediacy of the recollections. The National Library's Cyclone Tracy interviews by Dr. Alice Stack were recorded in January 1975, some just 1 week after the cyclone swept through the city. These interviews make you feel like you're close to the historical moment as you're listening. However, the original motivations for collecting the interviews are often at odds with the questions of the research project. None of the archived interviews we analysed were recorded for the purposes of understanding parents' experiences. Often the interviews want to know about the disaster itself and conclude with an eye on the future. For example, journalist Amanda Gearing, who collected the Queensland flood interviews, wanted to understand the failings of authorities in preventing the floods and organising disaster response. So a key consideration of this project is the ethics of using these archived interviews. Oral historians debate the ethics of secondary reuse of archived interviews, as oral history methodologies often centre the importance of relationships and rapport between interviewer and interviewee. For this reason, we have tried to apply the highest ethical standards to our use of these interview materials, listening to the original files where available and reading transcripts carefully and respectfully. As these interviews have varying scopes and agendas, I've had to sift through hundreds of files to find references to children, family, parenting, and care responsibilities. Despite the fact these interviews weren't taken to understand the experience of parenting, all of these archives had a significant number of interviews with mothers. So in analysing these interviews, the major conclusion that runs throughout this project is that mothers experience a heightened care burden during disaster, and that's true now and was true in the past. Several sub-themes emerge. Parenting is a central theme that was identified in all the interviews with mothers. The interviews reveal the actions and the choices mothers make to protect their children during disaster. Mothers likewise negotiate their children's and their own emotions during times of crisis. And mothers play key roles in remaking home after disaster, ensuring their children's physical and emotional comfort. Firstly, parenting. The interviews examined show that mothers have a heightened care burden during times of disaster. They often take responsibility for the immediate care and survival of their children. Mothers make decisions of what to do with the children before, during, and after the disaster, how to keep children occupied, calm, clothed, and fed, and what to tell the children about the experience as it's happening and after it's happened. Leela was a Darwin mum and self-described housewife who had to look after her children during Cyclone Tracy. The cyclone hit Darwin on Christmas Eve in 1974 and destroyed 90% of Darwin's buildings. Leela's husband was out at work and she was left at home with her 2 children. She prepared for the cyclone by filling the bathtub with water, bringing in the bins and gathering a bag with personal important items. During the storm, she lay on the lounge room floor with the children on cushions. Leela was worried they'd get trapped in the house, so they raced across to the garage and sat in their station wagon to wait out the storm. Some neighbours ended up sheltering with them in the car.
Well, it was a pretty awful night. Didn't seem as though it would ever, and we were all sitting there praying, looking after the kids. They were all so good. Even the dogs didn't move, the kids didn't move. Everyone was marvellous. Nobody complained. Well, everyone was wet because they'd all ran across in the rain, and the father that had been hit on the head, he probably had concussion or shock because he sat there quietly all night, never made a sound. Nobody complained. The only thing was everyone wanted to go to the toilet. They were wet and they were cold. The kids kept saying, we've got to go to the toilet. And the power lines down everywhere, so we wouldn't let them out of the car. And one little boy, we had to sort of hang him out the door in the end because he just had to go to the toilet.
So as you can kind of see, Leela's interview focuses on the events of the storm. She praises her children for their stoicism and not complaining. And she's mostly worried about her children's physical safety during the event. And the rest of her interview kind of focuses on these themes as well. It shows that mothers During Cyclone Tracy and probably other disasters, have had to turn to the practicalities of parenting during crisis. Their primary responsibility is often to care for their children and look after their immediate needs. Nearly 40 years later, the January 2011 Queensland Floods saw many mothers take primary care for their children during the disaster. Flash flooding inundated many homes. Nikki was at home with her 19-year-old daughter, her 10-year-old son, and his friend at her home in Postman's Ridge. Her husband was away in Western Australia for work. The boys were outside playing in the rain, rounding up the chickens, when Nikki saw a mass of water coming towards the house. The Queensland Fire and Rescue Service came down their driveway and told them they needed to evacuate. Initially hesitant, Nikki had to make quick decisions to ensure her children's survival. Quote, "I got the life jackets out for the two boys and he put them on them. I explained to the boys that they needed to listen, to do as they were told. The kids are panicking because the dogs are out and the dogs started chasing the chickens. So the firefighters were sort of getting the boys, and between the two of them, they got the boys across, and then they came across and got me and my daughter." Nikki had to make her children realize the gravity of the situation and communicate their need to cooperate. She made the decision for the rescuers to save the boys first. Quote, "I just said, right, get these boys out of here first." Mothers don't only look after their children's physical safety, they also care for their emotional well-being during and post-disaster. A change seen across the interviews is the centrality of emotion to mothers' stories. Leela's interview in 1975 is notably devoid of emotion, and she praises her children for their fortitude. Later mothers pay sharp attention to their children's emotions, particularly in the aftermath of a disaster. Part of their care is negotiating the layered emotions of their children. Virginia's home was flooded in Wagga Wagga in 2012. After the flood, Virginia talked to her 4-year-old son about the flood and the damage, communicating to him that objects and goods were not important. Quote, "He was really good when we talked a lot about what really matters. We did a lot of drawings about what really matters." Virginia worried that her son would react badly to the damage done to the house and the brutal process of throwing their possessions away. Quote, "I was hoping he wouldn't see some of those things go, but he did. We kept saying stuff is just stuff, and then he'd repeat that back to me every time I found something and went, oh. He'd say, stuff is just stuff, Mum." Virginia communicated clearly to her son and monitored his emotional responses. Cleaning her home and making it safe for her son was also central to Virginia's post-flood story. She knew that the block was on a floodplain when she bought the house, but was told it would only flood once in every 35 or 40 years. Even though 2 floods had already threatened their home, one in 2012 and the other in 2010, Virginia wanted to stay in the area as she believed it was a good place to raise her child. Likewise, mothers affected by the Queensland floods focused on homemaking after the disaster. For Lisa, mother of 5, remaking her home was a central way in which she could provide a safe place for her children. Their home had been badly damaged by the floods. Instead of wanting to relocate after the disaster, Lisa wanted to stay. Many residents saw the Queensland floods as a rare occurrence and opted to rebuild on the same site. Lisa and her family loved the area as it was close to Brisbane but far away enough for a rural lifestyle, and she was greatly attached to their home. She notes it's, quote, "my children's home. That's all they've ever known. That's their home. I brought them home from the hospital, and that's all they ever known." Lisa sees the day that they finish the house and move in will be a return to normality.
So the day that the house is built, everything's in, I make my kids' beds and put the picture up on the wall. That will be the day I go, okay, we're done now. We're home. Yeah, it's all ready. We're back to, life's good. We're back to normal. Normal. If there is ever normal in our house. So yeah, but we'll get there.
So many mothers in these interviews see home as a site of emotional comfort and a marker that life can return to normal post-disaster once they're able to move back in. So what did these interviews spanning 1974 to 2012 tell us about mothers' historical experiences of environmental disasters? It is clear that parents have had to carry an additional care burden in disasters. They've had to ensure the safety of their children as well as themselves so they can look after their children, and sometimes protecting their children compromises their own safety. Caring for children is a form of emotional as well as physical labour. Parents tend to their children's feelings as well as their bodies. However, this role has changed over time. As I've already mentioned, Leela and Darwin talks a little of emotion, but we see the 2011-2012 mothers affected by floods focus on and worry over their children's emotional state sometime after the disaster. We also notice that in remembering disasters subsequently, mothers are more likely to talk about caring for their children during the crisis and to worry about the psychological impacts upon their children. These interviews also confirm the conclusion of broader disaster studies literature that parents adopt gendered roles during the disaster. As crises were unfolding, mothers were more likely to adopt the role of caring for children, while fathers were more likely to play a more practical role in defending the family home, as some of the closed interviews that I wasn't able to talk about today do. And in some of the examples here, we see fathers not being present due to work commitments during the disaster. Another key change over time is in these archived interviews is that disasters are often framed as once-off or rare or inevitable or once in 100 years. We see that with Virginia, we see that with Lisa. They are seen as infrequent enough for families to remain in the area and recover and rebuild on the same site. But mothers' experiences of crisis are shifting. Anissa and Carla's work on this project shows understandings of the frequency and risk of environmental disaster is changing and impacting the way mothers parent their children.
Thanks, Kat, and hi, everyone. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on unceded Wurundjeri country today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people here today. While it's beyond the scope of my talk today, the relationship between colonization and climate change is vital to consider. Not least because of the role of colonization in worsening climate change and because of the impacts of climate change not being evenly distributed. So it's important to frame what I'm talking about today as settlers' experiences on stolen land, and other researchers on the Mothering in Crisis project will soon be interviewing First Nations mothers about their experiences. So, in my talk today, I'll first share some background information about the interviews we recorded, and I'll then highlight 3 key themes from the interview material. And you'll see that some of the themes that Kat just spoke about actually run through and are quite prominent in the interviews we've recorded. So this year, Carla and I conducted 8 interviews with mothers living in Australia who had children aged 18 or younger. And my presentation today draws on these interviews, which we conducted to better understand how environmental disasters, such as floods and fires, and climate change more broadly, are impacting experiences of mothering in Australia in the 21st century. We began with a focus on mothers living in Gippsland, using Gippsland as a case study area, as Carla explained. But we faced some recruitment challenges. So the geographic scope was expanded to mothers living anywhere in Australia. 6 of the interviewees lived in Gippsland and the other 2 lived elsewhere. One was in Melbourne and the other was based in Brisbane. And the themes I'll share today emerged across the interviews, regardless of where the interviewees lived. So I won't make distinctions about exactly where each interviewee lives, just in the interest of brevity. 6 interviewees were born in the 1970s, and the other 2 were born in the 1980s. Interviewees were aged between 37 and 51 at the time of their interviews, and all interviewees were born in Australia. The mothers we interviewed were at various stages of motherhood. So collectively, their children's ages ranged from 4 to 23. And the interviewee who had a 23-year-old also had younger children. All the mothers we spoke to had their youngest child before the Black Summer fires and before the COVID-19 pandemic began. Now, these interviews took place against a backdrop of crisis. Storms, floods, high rates of household illness, and the ongoing pandemic all contributed to the wider context in which these interviews were conducted.
Most interviews covered both environmental disasters and climate change in detail, though some interviewees were more focused on climate and anthropogenic change in their accounts, while others focused more keenly on experiences of really specific environmental disasters. Experiences of disasters sometimes taught interviewees to anticipate future disasters. Sarah shared that her family's experience of the Black Saturday fires in 2009 taught her to expect and prepare for fires in the future. Sarah evacuated with her 2 young children during the Black Saturday fires, while her husband, a firefighter, stayed to defend their home. Her narrative highlights the extent of uncertainty she'd had to endure during those traumatic fires, including, as she says, not knowing if the house had survived and if he had survived. Their experience of Black Saturday prompted them to prioritize staying together as a family if they ever faced a similar situation again. Sarah said, "We made an agreement that if there's ever another fire, whatever we do, we both do. So if the house is defendable, I defend it as well." Sarah's experience of mothering through Black Saturday prompted her and her partner to tangibly prepare for future disasters in really concrete ways. Sarah now does annual evacuation drills with her children and pets. She said, "Hope we never have to do it for real, but we've practiced it every year since we've been here for like 10 years. So just to normalize it, because I think if things are going to get stressful, well-laid plans don't always work." So normalizing fire as an experience that her children may well encounter in the future is a part of how Sarah's parenting changed because of her family's experience of Black Saturday. Sarah's account suggests that her imagined realm of maternal responsibility grew in distinct ways because of the Black Saturday fires, and she now teaches her children to know exactly what to do on a really bodily, physical level in the case of another fire. Educating children about climate change and associated environmental disasters was another major theme across these interviews. Interviewees describe varied approaches to teaching their children about climate change, including having conversations about climate change, attending climate strikes with their children, and demonstrating to their children how to reduce their consumption, such as minimizing their use of plastic. And participants often situated their efforts to educate their children about climate change within broader educational efforts. Some, for instance, spoke of how they had fostered an appreciation of nature and the environment in their children when their children were very young. Many interviewees discussed the challenge of managing the tension between wanting to raise children who are informed about the climate crisis without generating too much fear or despair. Megan told me, "I didn't want to scare them too much, but at the same time, I want them to be critical thinkers and know that they can stand up for what's right and what needs to be done and have a voice." It's been a hard one because it's very scary, and I know kids are so literal and they worry about things and they don't articulate it always unless you ask them questions. And then you realize that they are actually really are worried, or they aren't really worried to the point that you think they might be. It was a real dilemma, and it still is for me, how much information to tell them or expose them to. Interviewees held varying attitudes about whether their children are being sufficiently educated about the climate crisis in schools. While Katerina spoke positively about climate change being discussed in primary school classrooms, many felt differently. Megan depicted classrooms as a space in which her children sometimes took on the role of educating their teachers because some teachers knew very little about the subject. Kate reflected on the prominence of endangered animal projects in her children's classrooms and noted that such projects are not accompanied with direct acknowledgement of climate change. And most participants framed educating their children about the climate crisis as something they were having to navigate on their own. The climate crisis is also shaping the values that interviewees like Louisa seek to instill in their children. Louisa explained the importance of, and I'm quoting here, making sure that they know that doing something about climate change and being active about that is something that we as a family really value. I want to show my kids when other people are doing that, so they don't just feel like, oh, mum's just always banging on about this. The challenge of managing or negotiating children's emotional responses to climate change, as Kat spoke about, was another major theme across these interviews in relation to both specific environmental disasters and climate change more broadly. Megan's earlier account about balancing sufficient education without prompting distress highlights how teaching children about climate change and managing their emotions are often intertwined concerns. Kate recalled turning the television off in her home during the Black Saturday fires, the Black Summer fires that began in 2019 to protect her young children from extreme distress. Her children had asked her about the smoke they smelt in the air, and Kate described the challenge of navigating that situation. She explained, when that happened, I just didn't know what to say to the kids. They're so young, like, how do they even understand what's going on? There's no framework here. Louisa and her family were affected by the floods in Brisbane earlier this year. And their home survived, but they were surrounded by devastation, and the floods caused enormous disruption to their family life. Louisa's oldest child had to attend a different school for some weeks, and Louisa and her younger child cried when they first saw that the park that her youngest child usually played in was underwater. Louisa highlighted how she cared for her children's emotional well-being during this crisis, but she also reflected on the distress her children experienced. She said, I think I felt pretty able to explain what was happening, but it still didn't make it any easier because you can explain what is happening, but that doesn't help emotionally necessarily. Like you can say, this is climate change happening, we're flooding because we live on a floodplain and because of the fact that we're having an increasing number of extreme weather events. But that doesn't help them when their school is flooded and their classroom is destroyed and their musical instruments are gone and all of that kind of stuff that happens to them. So I think I just tried to be honest, but I also tried to show what the community was doing. And I also tried to say, your school's amazing. Look at all these amazing people that are helping each other. And, but they were literally cars floating in her school oval. And she found that quite distressing, as did my son. So I guess I just tried to be honest, and I tried to look for all the positives about communities coming together, but I certainly did not try and shelter them at all. So across these interviews, mothers described the multiple and varied ways in which their parenting is affected by climate crisis. They spoke of how they seek to instill climate-related values in their children, attempt to ensure their children's physical safety, shape their children's behaviors, encourage activism, and help manage their children's emotional responses to climate crisis and environmental disasters. The themes I've shared today about learning from disasters to anticipate future ones, about teaching children about climate crisis, and about managing children's emotions through disasters and climate crisis depict some of the challenges that interviewees face as they raise children in 21st century Australia. And these themes all relate to broader questions about how to support children through crisis and prepare them for environmental disasters. Interviewees' accounts often portray this as a challenge that mothers are facing largely alone as individuals or families. And their reflections raise questions about the extent to which educating and supporting children through climate crisis is a parental or societal responsibility. Kate's earlier words about the lack of framework to guide her when her children ask questions about smoke during the Black Summer fires highlights a wider sentiment expressed in many interviews about the lack of guidance and resources to advise and support parents who are navigating these challenges. So I'll wrap up there, but I would just like to end with a few thanks to the project team for all their hard work and support. It's been a really wonderful team to be part of, and a big thank you to all the interviewees who so generously shared their lives and experiences with us and who made this research possible. I'll hand over back to Carla. Thanks.
Thank you, Anissa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our interviews with UK mothers before I'll draw some overarching conclusions from the project as a whole. I've literally just completed a research trip to the UK where I interviewed 8 mothers in Wales about the impacts of climate change upon their experiences of raising children. We literally don't have all the transcripts completed for these interviews yet, so it's the definition of early stage analysis. But because I did these interviews in quite a short space of time, I did have a very strong sense while I was conducting them of the themes that were coming through. So there were both similarities and differences to the Australian interviews. So like the Gippsland case study, we kept the inclusion criteria deliberately broad. So anyone currently living in Wales with at least one child under the age of 18 was eligible to participate. In practice, the interviewees were mainly drawn from South Wales because most of my advertising was through networks around Swansea and Cardiff. And like the Gippsland case study, we deliberately offered a participation payment to try to elicit volunteers beyond people that were just altruistically motivated to participate in the research. Most of the people who volunteered to do an interview were tertiary educated and working in white-collar professions. Most were UK born, some with Welsh heritage, some with English heritage, and one with Pakistani heritage. And I was also speaking to people and giving talks around Scotland, Wales, and England during the time I was there. And it really felt to me that climate change is not being experienced as tangibly and as palpably in the UK as it is in Australia, which we know is particularly vulnerable to climate change. In the UK, there is a sense of living through crisis, but they're of a different nature, I would say. So UK mothers spoke about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I argue we can understand as an environmental crisis as much as a health crisis, and its profound influence upon their parenting. And this was particularly acute for women who became mothers for the first time during the pandemic. So they talked about having to give birth without a partner present until they were in established labour. Talked about having to battle breastfeeding difficulties without in-person support. So one woman described the lactation consultant coming to the window and she was breastfeeding the child at the window to try to get advice. And they were adjusting to all the challenges of new parenthood without the close involvement of extended family, new parent supports or other forms of support. There's also a real sense of political crisis and fragmentation in the UK at the moment. Many ordinary people are complaining of a lack of strong or effective leadership, and I'm sure you've all seen in the news the revolving door of prime ministers. Most are worried about escalating costs of living, particularly energy prices. And really interestingly, in both Scotland and Wales, locals were keen to distance themselves from Westminster and spoke of their desire for greater independence from England. So in Wales, people told me of their sense that England had always looked down on Wales. One mother felt this was encapsulated in the discarding of the UK's nuclear waste in Wales, as though it's just a place where England dumps the things it doesn't want. And the same mother told me that England sees itself as having to prop up Wales economically, but in fact, Welsh water kept the rest of the UK hydrated during their recent summer drought. So this was her sense of the relationship. She also told, and in general, the kinds of recent environmental disasters experienced in the UK are nothing like the scale and intensity that we've experienced in Australia. But the UK has been experiencing unusually warm heat waves and a drought during the Northern Hemisphere's 2022 summer. And so people who are climate aware took this as a sign of things to come. So when I was visiting in November, people remarked constantly on the fact that the weather was not behaving as it normally would in autumn. Temperatures were several degrees higher than normal, and although Wales is normally a wet place, people said that the heavy drenching rains and really strong gusty winds that we were experiencing were unusual, and there were several weather warnings while I was there. So mothers in the UK have a sense that their day-to-day and their seasonal experiences of weather patterns are shifting, and this in turn affects their experiences of their local places around them. And they communicated their sense that the UK is in political disarray. But overall, I'd say UK mothers gave me more of a sense that they are mothering against a backdrop of climate change rather than a sense of disasters impacting on everyday life. So it was not so much recent crisis experiences that they spoke about, but rather a sense of foreboding about disasters to come. UK mothers shared with me some very powerful and very difficult emotions evoked by climate crisis. All were worried about climate change and particularly the impacts that it would wreak on their children's lives in the future. Laura described herself as a white British lesbian and she's a co-mother. So her wife became pregnant with donor sperm via IVF and they have a child who's now 2 years old. Laura told me that she wonders if her son will be angry with her when he's older for bringing him into a world so profoundly impacted by environmental degradation. So you can read the full quote on the screen, but she said to me, I think a lot about his future. I have a scenario that runs through my head of him turning around and being like, why did you do this in the most consciously chosen way possible? So IVF. It could never have been an accident. It could never have been anything other than your aggressive will. Why did you do this and put me in a world that's doomed? We're trying to have a second child and I just think, what are we doing? I want it, but how can I justify it? There's a real sense of grief in Laura's account, and she told me that she can't talk about this with many people, including her partner. She feels that the world has degraded since her own childhood, and she's concerned about further impacts to come. Rose is a white British woman in a heterosexual relationship with 2 children. And her account contained a very similar grief to Laura's. The worsening climate crisis has made her doubt whether she made the right decision 10 years ago to have children. She told me she feels a sense of guilt and shame for the fact that she's clearly implicated in the climate crisis. And she said, I guess what I'd like for them, this is her children, is to be able to live a life when they get older that they don't look back on their life with shame in the way that I do. And then she used again that word later on, that I have the guilt or the shame that I feel. And she has this really interesting metaphor. You know, this isn't like an asteroid is coming and no one could have done anything about it. You know, this is like an asteroid that we made and I was part of that. And I think she's probably thinking about the recent movie, was it Don't Look Up Now? That one. But a really interesting analogy. So many of these UK interviewees seem to feel a sense of impotence in the face of the climate emergency. The problem clearly feels much bigger than they are. But nevertheless, many are trying to transform these difficult emotions through action in the world. Several mothers spoke to me about trying to help their families live more sustainably through doing things like reducing consumption and waste and energy usage. Some also spoke about deciding not to eat meat or to no longer travel by air as a means to reduce their carbon footprints. But only a couple of them were involved in environmental activism. Judy is a Welsh mother in a heterosexual relationship with 2 children, and she and one of her children are neurodiverse. Judy seems to be, in many ways, more successfully transforming these difficult and distressing emotions sparked by climate change into a sense of agency in the world. So this is in both her working life and her home life. So her working life involves educating the community, particularly school children, about regenerative agriculture and growing food at home. And she links this very actively to the need to prepare for increased food scarcity due to climate change. And in this quote, you can see on your screen, she explains all the ways in which climate change informs her family's behaviours. So she said the climate crisis infers 95% of their decisions from what they eat, how they grow food, they built a little pond. I'm constantly talking about pollination and bees and soil health. Going forward, it's going to be essential that they know this information, that they know how it fits. So she said, I know we're doing loads, and she lists a bunch of things they're doing. It just doesn't feel enough. And this is where I am now. I feel a sense of urgency. I was talking to my friend on the weekend. She was like, you're going to have to look after yourself. I feel like I don't know what to do next apart from prepping for more security. So she's thinking about having food security when food systems are disrupted. Now, it's interesting in terms of the emotional tone of this interview. I really felt that it was much more upbeat and positive than many of the other interviews I conducted. And I think it's possibly because through being so active personally and professionally, Judy has managed to avoid some of the feelings like guilt and shame that Rose described. But like the other mothers, she's desperately worried about our climate present and future. But I had more of a sense that she feels motivated to continue taking climate action in her own life. So like Australian mothers that Anissa described, UK mothers are carefully weighing up how to raise their children and how much to tell their children about climate change. Many opt to educate their children about living sustainably and doing things like rejecting mindless consumption, but many tell them as little as possible about the frightening possible futures of climate crisis. Judy's perhaps more frank with her kids, possibly because of what she explains here. She said, I've always been pretty honest with them, but obviously in that sort of hopeful, like, oh, look what we're doing. It's always followed by action. But my greatest fear really was for them to get to teenage levels and all of a sudden totally understand it, and then to absolutely lose their minds and be completely angst-ridden. So she tries to keep track of their stress levels, but they don't seem to be worried about it. But neither of them has ever sort of asked me, you know, the question like, how serious is it? And she talks about how she's pretty bad at lying. And she said, I don't know what's going to happen when they ask those questions. So she's worried. She wants to be honest with her children, but she's worried about what will happen if they ask her really directly. How bad is it? So overall, I found in these interviews that climate change is stirring up really potent feelings for mothers in the UK that are very uncomfortable to live with. And the UK mothers, like Australian mothers, are largely coming up with their own solutions for dealing with climate change. But there are also many of them, I'd say, feeling isolated from other mothers who share their concerns, not sure who they can talk about these issues with, and they're craving additional guidance and support on how to raise children in the midst of a climate emergency when we don't have our own childhoods and our own experiences of being parents as a really accurate or relevant guide. So what can we conclude from these three project strands? I'll talk first about some comparative conclusions across time and place. So we've seen that parents have a distinctive disaster experience and that they often carry an additional burden during disasters, sometimes quite literally in the sense of carrying their children. Mothers' roles are more likely to be taking care of children during disasters, and that's both emotional and physical care. That experience is intensifying in an era of increased disasters. And so I think overall, Australian families' experiences of disasters are changing as disasters become more frequent and severe. And it becomes really difficult for people to maintain hope and resilience, which is kind of what everyone craves, stories of hope and recovery, when the periods of repair and therefore the opportunity for recovery contract. Mothers in both the UK and Australia have a very strong sense that they're parenting against this backdrop of climate change. But I would say Australian mothers have a more heightened awareness of disasters and disaster risks, those most extreme aspects of climate change because of their recent experiences. And we've seen impacts on both maternal emotions and behaviours. The emotional impacts are broad and varied. There's the stress of protecting children during disasters. There's anxiety about fertility decisions and, you know, whether to have children and how many. There's grief and nostalgia about changes to homes and communities, and mothers reflect upon these changes across their lifetimes. There's guilt and shame about their own contributions to environmental destruction. And there's also sometimes anger at government and private industry for failing to safeguard their children's futures and continuing to fail to safeguard their children's futures. But in addition to these extremely challenging and difficult emotions, we've seen love, hope, optimism, and incredible resilience in these narratives. So we've found that mothers are not simply passive in the face of these difficult emotions. They're developing their own strategies and finding their own solutions. And climate change is impacting on many of their decisions and their practices. It's things like deciding to limit family size. They're really actively evaluating the safety and the resilience of their family homes, both in terms of increased disaster risk and also anticipated resource scarcity. They're developing strategies to care for children during those moments of environmental disaster. And they're also adapting their child-rearing strategies to nurture particular qualities that they think might be most beneficial to their children going forward into a still uncertain future. Overall, they're working really hard to manage the emotional care of their children, but also of themselves in the face of climate crisis. And the reason this project is entitled Mothering in Crisis was really because I wanted to play on the ambiguity of that phrase. These mothers are raising children through multiple and overlapping and compounding crises. So they're mothering through crisis, but then this really raises for us the question, does this leave mothering itself in crisis? And as I said, this project began with my conviction that we're entering a new era in the history of the family. And I think our pilot research this year has confirmed that so far. We know that motherhood, parenthood, and family are always influenced by the historical context in which they take place. I think what's distinctive in the 21st century is that environmental forces are exercising an unusually large influence. There's a distinctive new generation of mothers emerging for whose child rearing is fundamentally shaped by this rapid and often destructive environmental change. We might call this motherhood in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene being the term for a geological era in which human behaviour exercises a larger influence than any other. So Anthropocenic motherhood is characterised by this normalisation of crisis and the requirement that mothers adopt a new repertoire of child rearing abilities, both to support their children through recurrent disasters, but also to raise them with a sort of future focused gaze with the skills to live on a warming planet. So I'm trying to think about some of the implications of this today. And I was aware that online and in person, we have a really mixed audience of some interviewees, some historians, people in policy, people from other disciplines as well. So I've tried to think really broadly about this. I think we can think about the implications in economic, social, and emotional terms. We can also think about them in terms of climate action, climate adaptation, and climate resilience. First of all, when we measure the costs of climate change, it's really vital that we include the impacts upon families, and I don't think we're doing that enough at the moment. The personal and cultural impacts that we've outlined are only going to increase in the 21st century. And other adjacent research that I'm doing is showing that climate change is already impacting potential mothers in the sense that there's many women who are ambivalent about having children because of their concerns about the environmental future. And I would argue that the single biggest contributor to this concern is a lack of sufficient climate action. So what was really interesting, and we've been conducting interviews about reproductive decisions across this year, is that during the May federal election, the election of a slightly more climate conscious federal government really changed the tone of these interviews, and it injected a thread of hopefulness into some of those interviews about reproductive decisions. So in other words, if climate crisis has a negative impact on both our experiences of and our hopes for family, I would argue that climate action has a demonstrably positive impact, and it's too early for us to give up on that. In terms of social policy and support services, I think when we plan for climate change adaptation, we need to plan much better to support families. We've seen that mothers are coming up with their own solutions, but they'll need additional supports as they manage new parenting challenges that we've probably never faced before, such as giving birth during a pandemic or breastfeeding an infant during a disaster. We need to recognise that disaster is the new normal in the 21st century, which means that mothering through crisis is becoming increasingly common. So I think we need to reform our government and community supports accordingly. As just one example, at present, disaster recovery and relief services and family support services tend to be completely separate arms of government and separate policy areas. And I think they're both going to need to work together much more closely across the next century in an era of escalating disasters. But in emotional and psychological terms, we're going to need to create spaces for these difficult emotions sparked by climate change. And this doesn't only affect mothers. We're going to need empathetic witnesses more than ever before. And some of those will be professionals like psychologists and counsellors and therapists who will need targeted training to support clients through the challenging emotions sparked by climate crisis. And people like Psychologists for a Safe Climate are already starting that work. But we're also going to need to train other types of professionals to deal with the distress including community health practitioners, social workers, teachers, and more. It's going to become part of everyone's life. And I think we're also going to need artists, and we're going to need researchers like oral historians who can bear witness to climate grief and eco-anxiety and help us to find ways to express and transform those ecological emotions, some of which humans have never experienced before. We're all going to need help to build strong networks among our friends, families, and communities to support each other in disruptive times. So these are challenging and painful times for people who are living with the uncomfortable reality of the climate emergency. But I think they're doubly painful times for parents because they're not worried not just about what they will experience, but also what their children will experience after they are gone. And mothers have told me this quite often. So we need compassionate listeners who can hold space where climate grief can be articulated. And more this century, we're going to need spaces where people can talk about the difficulties of living through climate crisis and share their strategies for coping with that. It's not going to be easy work, but it's going to be vital, I'd argue, for dealing with the emotional repercussions of living through the Anthropocene. And we know that mothers do a lot of the care work in every society. That's been borne out by research across many disciplines. They're incredibly resilient and resourceful, and they're also deeply motivated to continue looking after their families and communities. But I do think that mothers have limits to what they can do on their own. And as a society, I think we're going to need to look after mothers better so they can continue to take care of those around them as we navigate the enormous dynamism and the strain that is generated by living in a climate changed world. I'll stop now and I'll pass over to Catherine and I'll ask my other speakers to come up. We've got probably about 10 minutes for questions, and then we're going to convene for lunch in the foyer, and we can continue having discussions and questions after that.
Thanks, Carla. I think you're I think we'll all be processing that differently, depending on our perspectives and whether we're mothers or thinking about being mothers or grandparents. And so there's, I think you can tell why this project has been such a gem out of all of the projects we've been supporting. I'd also just like to flag quickly before we move to questions. There's also a project we supported called Climate Superpowers, and that looks to what you were sort of ending on in terms of what are the ways that we can support particularly our children to think about the agency that they have in the times that we're living in. So I'd encourage you to look up climatesuperpowers.org online, and it's a really fantastic initiative that was developed by some colleagues here in public health. But let's move to the questions and discussion. So
There's nothing online.
okay, we'll start with in the lecture theatre. Any questions? Yes. Can you please introduce yourself too?
My name is Connie. I'm Melbourne Uni graduate education. I want to ask when you research on those mothers, what is the education level of the mothers? So I was aware there was research on if the mother are university graduate, their children tend to be a higher IQ. I don't know how true it is now, but I'm wondering if the mothers are well educated. I think their children may be better, aware of climate change issues.
Yeah, sorry, I might jump here for the camera. I think it's a very wide lens camera. I'll just repeat that paraphrase very quickly for people online. So the question is from Connie, and it's about the education level of the mothers involved. I won't try to comment on their children so much because they weren't part of our research and I'd be speculating. But in terms of the mothers, we found that most of them did tend to be tertiary educated. And this has been found with other research into environmental activism, and people that are highly involved in environmental activities tend to be more likely to be tertiary educated people. That was borne out in this study, and Anissa might want to comment on this as well, but in both the UK and the Australian mothers, the people that volunteered to be involved in a study like this tend to be people that are already thinking about environmental issues, and I would probably say they're probably climate aware. They're relatively well informed, and they certainly already think that climate change is real and is important. Part of the reason that we offered a participation payment in both countries was to try to draw in a wider audience beyond just people who felt like these issues are important. One of the really profound challenges we faced in Gippsland, but not in the UK, was that mothers are exhausted. There's been a little bit of stuff in the conversation recently about disaster fatigue. And I think that there was an irony that Anissa and I found, that the very reason that we felt like this was so important to study, because mothers are living through multiple overlapping crises, made it really hard for those self-same mothers to make time to volunteer to do an interview when they're just trying to keep their family fed and clothed. And it's one of the reasons we had to adapt our methodology several times during the project. And it's interesting because I've been speaking to other people in social sciences doing qualitative and quantitative research this year, and they've found the same thing, but particularly in Victoria, that families in Victoria are completely exhausted. And for those of us who've been living in Victoria since, across the last few years, we understand why that is. So yeah, I think there's definitely a particular cohort of women who volunteered, and I think that these people are probably at the forefront of the cultural shift that I'm talking about. I think that some of these ideas will start to permeate more widely as well, I suspect. Yeah.
Thank you. I will ask another question later. After
Sure. Thank you.
There's another question at the back.
Hi, my name is Deb. Thanks for a fabulous presentation from everyone. Just so much going on there, really rich material and wonderful to see as well. The question I have is, well, of all the interview material that you've shown here, the thing that struck me the most was the work that you're doing in the UK, because it wasn't in that kind of overlapping crisis disaster fatigue context, where women are able, in this instance, perhaps to talk more freely about grief. Because what happens in the disaster context, of course, is there's so much else going on, which might be in an emergency context. There's quite a masculine discourse around, particularly North Queensland, some beautiful work that I've done up there, around cyclones and floods. It's always this kind of emergency responder. There are multiple discourses to negotiate as you try to ascertain what your respondent really is trying to tell you. Whereas the UK material that you showed was just, there's something really gripping about that material, and the able to articulate clearly that grief or fear, anxiety, worry. I'd really love to hear where you want to take that, because I think there's something in that you could apply here again in this much wider context of Australia. And then some of those issues of class and education, you could maybe then start unpacking that more as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Deb. It's such a great question. I can't really paraphrase that really succinctly. But Deb was commenting that there was more a sense of really difficult and distressing emotions, perhaps in the UK interviews, emotions like grief, less perhaps in the Australian interviews. I'm going to get Anissa to comment in a minute, because we both did the Australian interviews, about what she thinks about that. One thing I'll say is I've been thinking about how living through recurrent crises puts us in a state of constant stress and heightened cortisol, and about how when you are living through crisis, whether it's a disaster like a fire or a flood, or whether it's just another lockdown's just been called and you have to deal with that, or your kids just got COVID and you have to deal with that. I think many parents get immediately, so you get this little kind of rush of adrenaline and cortisol, and like it's stress, but it's also there's things to do, right? There's things to do, and you just do the things. And perhaps Australian mothers have been in that state for several years with very little chance to sit back and reflect. Whereas that hasn't been the kind of emotional state that the UK mothers have been in. I wonder if there's perhaps more difficult emotions in the Australian interviews than Anissa included, but I'm interested in what you think about that, Anissa.
I definitely agree that there's that kind of focus on action, and memories of actions taken and decisions around actions that are really prominent in the Australian interviews. There's definitely stuff about the emotions that mothers are dealing with, but I do think it's far more intertwined with the kind of emergency response decisions than kind of really broad picture pontificating about climate change as something that's possible in the future, but that's my sense.
We have an online comment question. Do you want me to read it out?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. So this is from Celia Roberts, ANU Sociology. Really interesting work, thanks to speakers. I want to question your assumption that mothers care more about children's futures than people who don't have children. We are conducting research of parents and non-parents about reproduction and climate crisis, and finding that people who do not have any children are very worried about children's futures as well. And many are deciding not to have children for that very reason. So whilst I can see that love for one's own children might make worries about climate crisis very painful, I think it's important not to assume that people without children care less about climate change's effects on current and future generations. So thanks, Celia. I'll let you do answer.
Great question, Celia. No, I hope we didn't give that impression. I think what's different about when you're a parent that already has a child is that the future is embodied and tangible in the form of your child. It's not hypothetical, it's real. You've got a real person in front of you who you are thinking about their real future. And another thing that some of the mothers I've interviewed, I'm just trying to think if this was both, it was both countries, but more in the UK, talked about was their concern that their children won't feel freely able to make a choice about having children, if that makes sense. So their hypothetical grandchildren, that their children, when they're adults, will reach a point where they think it doesn't feel tenable to decide to have children. The other work that I mentioned that I'm doing is called Maternal Futures, and it's interviewing Australian women about their reproductive decisions, and some of them are they're all ambivalent. No, most of them are ambivalent. Some of them are deciding they probably won't have children because they're worried about the future. And I would agree with you that is a really fascinating way in which their hypothetical children are very real in the minds of these women. And some of them have said things like, because I love my unborn child, I'm not having them. It's a pretty powerful thing to say. So it's fascinating in terms of ethics. They are developing ethical relationships with hypothetical children who are not born and who will not be born because of the ethical decision that they're making. But those potential children are very real to them, and some of them describe what they imagine these children would look like as well. So I would agree with you absolutely that children are powerful in the minds of both parents and potential parents, in the sense that all of us are potential parents. But I do think that there's distinctive differences between the ways that plays out. And with some of the mothers that we're interviewing, there's this sense of, I mean, I could guess you could say in the quote that I shared from Laura, that she feels a sense of guilt that perhaps she shouldn't have had her son. And that's possibly, arguably, the hardest thing that a parent could ever say, I think. Maybe one of the very hardest things you could ever say. Yeah.
And I can't believe you can say that and
still keep your composure, you know?
Oh,
sort of
it's
material.
really hard, and I want to. I was actually thinking about this on the way here. I want to acknowledge that it's hard for everyone talking about. It's hard for our interviewees. It's hard for us as researchers. It's hard for audiences. And actually, in the next phase of my work, I'd like to think more actively about sort of, I guess, the journey that we take audiences on as well. It's probably not obvious to you, but I try to include hopeful pictures, particularly towards the end of my talk. That's why I included images of children playing in disasters, that children continue playing even in floodwaters and amidst fires. But it's not easy to hear these things. It's not easy to talk about them, to listen to them. And that's something I think there's also an ethics of how you present research, and I want to do a bit more work around that, because I don't want to stop talking about these issues, but I also just acknowledge the extreme difficulty of talking about them. Yeah.
A question down the front, and then I'll. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Emma Dalton, a sessional subject coordinator in the now defunct theatre program, but still teaching it at the Trove. Yes. Have you or will you engage with Sarah Ruddock's maternal thinking and concepts around preservative love in the publications coming out of this?
Thank you, Emma. It's a great question. Emma and I know each other from a maternal studies reading group, and we talk about maternal theory in that group. So Sarah Ruddock was a philosopher who published some really formative work in the 1980s that was trying to get beyond the great feminist concern with motherhood has been that as soon as you talk about motherhood, you risk essentializing certain categories, certain qualities that are seen to be possessed by mothers. She was trying to get beyond the idea that mothers are a certain way because of biology, and she argued that it's through the practice of primary care for a child that mothers develop certain capacities, a certain ethics of being in the world that's quite an altruistic and reflexive mode of being in the world. It's not only women that can develop that capacity, but because women are more likely to be primary carers, they're more likely to develop that, but anyone can potentially. And I think it's certainly, I mean, it inflects a lot of my thinking. And I think in the sense that one of the distinctive things about mothers, and one of the reasons that I wanted to study mothers as a particular group in relation to climate crisis, is that I think mothers have this really special relationship to the future because of their relationship to their children. Because one of the things Ruddock says is that it's an essential part of child rearing that you're raising your children towards the future. You have an understanding of what your society is and what it will be in the future and what it means to be a member of that society, and you're raising your child to be an active member of that society. And one of the implications for this work is that if the future will look radically different from what mothers experienced as they themselves were growing up, it becomes a much more imaginative and challenging exercise to raise your children towards a future which is highly uncertain, and there's still a range of possible futures stretching before us. So I do think Ruddock's work has really, interesting implications for this. Yeah.
I've been a very bad facilitator.
No, that's all right.
We're well over time, but Anne, you had a question.
Thank you. Anne Stanson, developmental psychologist, and been working on kids with climate change for a while. But my question is really going back more to kindness about, quite understandably, the people that you interviewed have been those who tertiary educated and so on. And we know that people with disadvantaged circumstances have got a lot more immediate concerns with climate change, which is witnessed by our election, where we didn't see the swing to the Greens, who got the strongest climate policies to do something about this. But we also know that more disadvantaged people are going to suffer much worse in the time of climate crisis and extreme weather events and so on. And their kids are going to be at greater risk as well. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about
those people who are harder to reach to have these conversations, but are going to have an equal need for support in how they do help their children deal with this issue. How we go along with that? So your recommendations all worked really well, but people who are thinking about this, that is front of mind, what happens for those where more immediate concerns are people in the feel that they will get used to those. Yet they go together a lot more through the marketplace.
It's a really important question. I'd love to talk about this more with you, particularly recruitment for this kind of research, because I think it's really important to have a broad range of views. I think it's partly about language. So unfortunately, in Australia, we have this strange relationship to climate change where it's a politicised term, and I think it's become less so, but it still is seen as having ideological and political and partisan connotations. It's not necessarily that way in other places. But I think maybe to have those discussions, both in terms of recruiting people, but also talking about solutions and supporting people, will be to use different language. So to say, how are you coping with the rising cost of food or difficulties getting certain foods? What kind of solutions can we put in place to make sure that your family is still eating well? You know, talking about growing food at home, other kinds of things. How is your family going with the rising cost of energy prices, and how are you? So I suspect that the answer is partially breaking things down into those components that we all feel and we all share, but as you point out, affect people differently. Housing would be another big one to talk to people about, because I think they're questions that unite people. Like, we all need to feed ourselves, and we all need to live somewhere, and we all need to keep warm and dry and safe. So that would be my initial thought about that. It might be, I don't know how, maybe it would be harder to have these conversations about environmental emotions. I don't know. One of the things I was hoping to do this year was to try to get involved with some local groups in Gippsland. And again, I think it's because people are so fatigued by crisis. I didn't have great responses when I tried to reach out to community organisations, but I'm thinking about play groups, and I'm thinking about neighbourhood houses, and I'm thinking about just different places in the community where people might come for all sorts of different reasons, where it might be possible to start having group conversations, as I said, that might use language that isn't burdened in the way that climate change language is burdened in Australia. It's a great question. We might, wrap up towards lunch. I really invite everyone that can stay to join us for lunch. I'd love to continue these conversations with you all. And to thank once again Anissa and Catherine for being amazing co-researchers on this project. And to thank Catherine for funding the project and for being here to support us